Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And I'm so very glad you've joined me this evening. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. And you know the rules. Go and spoil yourself. Get yourself an effervescent sparkling drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. This is part 2 of our story, and we're getting to the meaty bits. But before we get there, I would recommend those of you who haven't heard part 1 to go back to it, because the whole idea of a story is to listen to the entire thing, because that makes it so much richer. As Hamish drove down the asphalt road, now glistening from rain, his windscreen wipers were working zealously against its feisty assault. In the distance he could hear the drum rolls of thunder and see the jagged flashes of lightning bolting across the sky. He found his mind lingering to the ill-omened day his mother had so inauspiciously lost her life. He remembers it as if it was yesterday. He had been informed by the grief counsellor that her death would get easier with the passing of time. But had it really? It had been hard on them all. If his mother was still around, he knew his dad would be so much more ebullient and younger for his years. He probably wouldn't be even using a walking stick. His sister Cordelia would probably not put up with Barker, the layabout boyfriend of hers, and he might have not been so eager to thrill-seek out the world's most dangerous waves. It was almost as if after her death that the broken parts of themselves had not been fully mended, and probably never would. He wondered if a small part of him had a death wish. He had never been suicidal or depressed, but the grief of his mother's passing had not been something that had weathered well on his young heart. He could see himself at 15 years old again, standing on the edge of the pavement opposite the zebra crossing, walking behind his mother. It hadn't been easy attending the school where his mother worked as a school teacher, as some kids had given him a hard time about it. But for Hamish it was water off a duck's back. He didn't allow a few nasty jabs about his mother to get him down. The accident had happened due to a detention his mother had given a young 15-year-old boy in his year called Mick. He remembered his mother's words in class that day quite vividly. "I've had enough, Mick Fuller, of your inexcusable behaviour. You're going to be going home late this afternoon. You'll be serving a detention. You better let your parents know about this." The boy had stuck his tongue out at Hamish's mother and muttered something very disagreeable under his breath that sounded like a few cursory words. Little did Hamish know that a few days later no one would live to regret that Mick had got a detention more than he would. On the day in question, Hamish was about to cross the zebra crossing when his glove fell onto the ground, so he bent down to retrieve it. At that precise moment in time, Mick had inadvertently started up his mother's truck when he'd seen that annoying teacher, Heather Harrison, who had given him that damned detention a couple of days before, was about to cross the zebra crossing. "Perfect!" he muttered to himself. "Just perfect!" He dropped himself into the driver's seat of his mother's truck and started up the engine. He had grinned to himself, deciding that to give the teacher a nasty scare was a great idea. Next time she'd think twice before she dared give him a detention again. Mick, satisfied that his mother was obliviously catching up with a conversation with an old friend across the way, outside the school gate, and was otherwise busily engaged, so he could pull off the stunt without her knowledge. In a second, because that's all it takes, a second, he had driven his mother's truck forwards, but it had hit Mrs. Harrison harder than he had expected. The jerk was so powerful. He had only tended to brush against her, but things had gone horribly wrong. At first he'd been laughing. Then Mrs. Harrison had somersaulted into the air from the heavy push. She was flung off her feet. Mick's facial expression grew grave when he comprehended the gravity of what he'd just done. He had no understanding of just how powerful his mother's truck really was. People emerged from everywhere, like the bees from a hive, buzzing over the scene in a frantic frenzy. People were shouting, "Oh my God! Oh my God! Someone please call 911 now!" Hamish was to understand that Mick had not done this intentionally. He had realised that his friend was naively foolish, and had only done this to teach his mother a lesson for daring to give him a detention after school. But the young man never expected things to get so out of hand. He was hoping the truck would give her a scare, by nearly bumping into her, missing her by a hair's breadth. But he failed to master the manoeuvre and ran into Mrs. Harrison, launching her off her feet, where she was walloped up in the air like a soccer ball and came crashing down like a floppy rag doll onto the asphalt road. For a moment there was a soundless silence at the scene. Mick had climbed out of his mother's truck, his face as white as a sheet, wearing a palpable horror in his expression. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he kept saying over and over again. "I just wanted to give her a scare, that was all." Mick's mother had come charging towards him, her body language furious. She was swaying like a tree that was lingering on unstable roots. "What the hell have you done, son? What do you mean by driving my truck?" The young man began to howl like a lonely coyote, while the ambulance sirens blared in the distance until they came close. Hamish was one of the people that were lost for words. He was so stunned. He stood there like a lemon, staring in disbelief at the horrifying scene that was unfolding before his eyes, almost as if he was caught up in somebody else's horrifying nightmare that had no bearing on reality whatsoever and had absolutely nothing to do with him. But in a trice he realised it had. He rocketed over to his mother's side, where she lay unyielding. Hamish began shaking his mother's body as hard as he possibly could to try and wake her up from her slumber. But she did not respond. Tears poured down his face. "No! No! Mum, wake up! Mum, wake up! Wake up, Mum!" He looked up at Mick, who was still howling, standing at his mother's side. She was as white as a sheet. "Look what you've done, Mick! You've killed my mother! How could you?" "I'm sorry, Bro. I didn't mean to hurt her." Mick had sobbed. Mick's mother guided him away from the scene, where he was being questioned by a police officer. The EMT asked one of the bystanders to help Hamish. "He needs sugar. He's had a dreadful shock." Mr. Miller, the sportsmaster, had kindly ferried him off to a staff room, where he was given Coca-Cola to drink, and he had spoken to him in soothing words that had become like background noise to him. He hadn't heard a single one of them. The rest of the day was a haze to him, a whirlwind of events that was somehow extinguished from his memory. But one thing he did remember was the grief the inauspicious baleful event had brought upon his entire family. The senseless days that were to follow were colourless and bland, while the joys of his life had been ruthlessly expunged. And there was a time Hamish thought he'd never ever be happy again. Mick, the young man responsible for his mother's death, was charged with second-degree murder and a felony hit-and-run, but he was prosecuted as a minor. Hamish could understand a young man getting his revenge on a teacher with some silly supercilious prank, rather like placing a fart cushion on a chair or crickets in her drawer. But this was going way too far, all because his mother gave the boy a detention. This was the kind of detention Mick was unlikely to ever forget. It would likely haunt him for the rest of his life. The young man had written to Hamish and his father apologising profusely for what he'd done. Hamish knew he meant every word, and felt an empathy for the younger man, having to live with this load on his conscience. But it didn't change the fact that his mother was gone, and there was no way to bring her back. If he was grateful for anything, it was that the coroner had assured his family that his mother would not have known a thing. She was out cold, and that knowledge brought him and his family a measure of reassurance, rather than having to watch their mother suffering, only to die later from the gravity of her injuries, which would only serve to postpone the inevitable. Sometimes a fast death could actually be kinder, but it didn't make it any easier. Hamish reflected over the state of his mother's gravestone, and how rudely it had been vandalised, with bright red paint and offensive words that he'd had to remove. Just thinking about it made his blood boil. How could people be so insensitive, so callous? He knew that red paint would be back again, as would the vandals. Surely there was a way of stopping them. Hamish then had a fabulous idea, and the good news was Hamish believed it might just actually work. The night of Hamish's plan. Hamish needed to arrive at the graveyard hours before anybody else did, The waifs and strays and the vagabonds, the drunks, the teenage enthusiasts, and last but not least the vandals that would meander here during the witching hours of the night to intercede with the spirits of the dead. Hamish knew he needed to park his car away from the nightly visitors' prying eyes, so he clandestinely chose a spot behind the old church, a clearing covered with so much grass that looked like no one had ambled over the area for years, as no telltale litter was found lying amidst the tall grass, and ugly weeds with obnoxious thorny tentacles devoid of any beauty could also be found towering through the brush like nature's cruelest eyesores, but remained undisturbed, which was a very good sign. This was a spot in the large graveyard, more forsaken and derelict than anywhere else, if that was at all possible. It would be the quintessential perfect hiding place where no one would know he'd camped down for the night, for he would be as ambiguously obscure as the furtively cunning coyotes in the woodgrove. Hamish flattened down some grass and pitched up a makeshift pop-up tent, along with everything else he was going to need for tonight's events. He had a very good feeling about all this and hoped that his plan might have some impact. He had to admit it was a magnificently beautiful day. It was mid-spring. The weather had been kind. The soft sunshine was filtering through the trees, almost as if the weather was conspiring to make everything go well for tonight's event. It was as if the graveyard, along with the old church, had had enough of the mean visitors who descended across the yard at night and were co-conspirators in helping Hamish achieve his goal. He had listened to the weather forecast that had promised fine weather for the next couple of days. The optimistic forecast made him feel even more upbeat. At the very least, it would mean that the evening would not be too fresh. But given what he was going to wear, he certainly wouldn't want it to be too hot either. He had been assured by the kindly lady at the costume shop that the costume was thermal regulated, but he doubted it very much, given how thick the fabric's hair was. He had to admit the costume looked remarkably realistic, and with the help of a dark night, to make things more foreboding and sinister, things could be very persuasive indeed. He knew there had been a plethora of Bigfoot sightings in these parts, and tonight he hoped to become the idiosyncratic creature himself. It was his aim to do his damnedest to scare the visitors to the cemetery so bad that they'd never ever come back to the graveyard again. But he knew he would need to make this an ongoing project for it to fully work. Once again, he decided to go and visit his mother's grave. He was here after all, so it was the right thing to do. He reluctantly ambled through the grass. His heart sank as he saw what he knew he would see. It would seem in only a few days the perfectly clean gravestone had been vandalized once again, as if it had been a blank canvas for a keen artist, but the words so callously thrust over the gravestone sent chills running down his spine. "She rides with the devil," followed by a skull and crossbones, along with the words bitch and 666. The white roses in the vase had died, while the gravesite looked a sorry sight indeed. Hamish could feel the bitter bile rising up at the back of his throat. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched as they punched the air aggressively. He could feel the infuriation consume him. "Sorry, Mum. You deserve to rest in peace," he said apologetically. "You probably wonder why I'm back at your gravestone so soon. I've had enough of these vandals trashing up your gravesite. Someone has to do something about this. The police have got their hands full, so I've thought up a plan. Wish me luck, Mum. I'm going to need it." He returned to his truck to collect the wicker basket containing the spritzer bottles and the paint remover, and fastidiously began removing the blazing red paint from his mother's gravestone, and replacing the wilted white stones in the vase with some fresh ones he'd brought along. Once again he began to pick up all the trash from the last few days that was spread around the graveyard so pervasively. He found a ouija board lying close to a large mausoleum that had been abandoned, and secretly hoped that whoever had been using it had somehow had a nasty scare. Growing up, he'd heard true stories about ouija boards, one of which came from his own father's brother's mouth, and was closer to home than he would have liked. "Tell us what happened, Uncle Joey, when you used a ouija board," Hamish had asked his uncle. His sister Cordelia had put her hands over her ears. "Don't tell me! I don't want to hear anything scary!" "I'm not sure it's appropriate, son," said his uncle, glancing from his father to his mother, as if looking for their approval, as he wasn't sure that Hamish's young ears should be privy to such information. "I don't hide anything from my children," Joey, his father, had said. "I think it's wrong for parents to willfully hide things from their kids. My children need to understand the dangers of playing with such things. So tell them what happened to you." Hamish's mother had nodded. "I'm with my husband on this. My children need to know about the hazards of playing with these things that are beyond their understanding." "Well," says Uncle Joey, stroking his salt and pepper-coloured hair, "I was never the same after playing with that Ouija board, let me tell you. It rattled me like nothing else I've ever known. Needless to say, your father was far too sensible to play with one. He wanted nothing to do with it. I had actually bought the thing from a shop in town, and I thought playing with it would be great fun. I took the board over to the next-door neighbour's house. I was 15 years old at the time, and Mark Saunders was a year older than me. We were very good friends, and in truth we didn't really believe that you could speak to the dead, or that there were things called demons that could mess with your head. I remember I pulled out the game from the cellophane wrapper. It comes wrapped up just like any regular game would. I was trembling with excitement, but when we started to ask the board questions with our hands on the planchette, it moved on its own accord and answered our questions for us. We both thought that either one of us was manipulating the planchette, but suddenly the room became icy cold. It wasn't natural. There is no way to describe this to you, but we could feel a presence standing in our midst and breathing heavily. It was a warm summer's night, and this chill descended before us was unlike anything I have ever experienced. It was pervasive and immediate. You knew you were in the presence of a demonical entity. You just knew it, and worse still, you could feel it watching you, although you couldn't see anything. We immediately let go of the blanchet. We were trembling with terror, but the blanchet continued to move on its own accord. We screamed, and Mark Saunders' older sister, who was very religious at the time, came into the room, and this thing, on seeing her, let out a loud growl. She glanced at her brother's bed, her face paling with astonishment when she saw the Ouija board, and of course the blanchet moving on its own. She immediately started to pray, commanding the thing to leave at once. And suddenly this ugly mist, like a black smoke with a gargoyle-like face in it, was staring at us, growling fiercely, its eyes as red as fire. I felt as if I was looking at the devil himself. I've never ever seen anything so grotesquely evil, so incredibly ugly. Mark Saunders' sister screamed at the entity. It fled, and the icy coldness left the room at the same time. She picked up the board, glared at us and screamed, "Don't you ever do that again!" And of course we never did. Never been so scared in my entire life. Hamish smiles as he remembers his uncle's story. He studies the costume he's planning to wear tonight. It had been made rather well. It was sufficiently well upholstered to make him look like he was an intimidating size, although he would remain under 6 foot, but there was not much he could do about that. He prepared himself for the evening ahead. He could not shake off the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced up at the dusty stained-glass windows of the church, and was sure he'd seen a movement, but it must have been a trick of the light, as when he looked up again, nothing was there. The witching hour. Hamish tried on his Bigfoot costume, wishing he had a long dress mirror to fully enjoy the whole effect, but he had a good feeling he looked the part. Now he hoped he could act like a Bigfoot convincingly. He'd been studying the behaviour of silverback gorillas on Animal Planet, and had tried to act out some of their movements. He thought his imitations of gorilla behaviour weren't too bad, although they could easily be improved. The last thing he wanted to do was to look like a man in a Bigfoot suit tonight. He needed to look like the real deal. The Bigfoot head of the costume was rather uncomfortable to wear, But if he needed to scare some of these youngsters away, he had to wear it. Even though the weather had been fine during the day, the temperature had dropped significantly, and there was a decided chill in the air. But covered in this thick costume, Hamish doubted he'd feel any cold. The whistling wind began to whip aggressively through the tall, lofty, statuesque trees that stood proudly on the periphery of the graveyard, like a long line of army generals guarding the cemetery. Their bony, convoluted arms and gnarled branches clawed outwards and upwards. They shook their new leaves wildly in the wind. The translucent light breathed life in the worn, faceless statues of praying children and winged angels, softening hard, broken edges, smoothing away fissures. Silence had engulfed the entire cemetery with a trepidatious sense of foreboding, while a dense fog wormed its way stubbornly through the graves. Hamish could see, perched on a tree branch, a bright pair of yellow eyes staring back at him. The owl straddled its feathery body onto one of the tombstones. A little rodent emerged through the long grass, and the white feathery winged creature dived towards the little animal, lifting it up in its sharp talons, flying back to a branch with its hungry beak digging into its squirming meal. And after he had finished, satisfied, he remained on the branch, his large yellow eyes fixed on Hamish. He let out a lowly hoot. When the night finally struck the witching hour, the ambience of the graveyard shifted. The light from the moon became diminished, the gravestones sombre and subdued. Before long, voices and laughter could be heard as 6 teenagers intent on mischief, wearing hoodies and jeans, ambled through the graveyard, their drunken, incautious laughter ringing out loudly between the gravestones. Hamish surreptitiously slipped through the graveyard, ducking cautiously behind gravestones as he made his way towards the gathering of teenagers. 1 or 2 were sitting against the gravestones, using the headstones like the stiff backing of a chair. They gathered around in a tight circle, and Hamish realised to his horror that they were about to play with a ouija board. He could hear the giggling voice of a young girl say, "We'll ask if there are any ghosts or ghoulies that haunt this graveyard." Hamish knew that this was his moment. He waited and listened. "Is anyone here?" came one of the voices. "What is your name?" "Oh, my word, it's spelling out the name Phelan. I saw a grave of a Phelan here the other day. Oh, my God, this is so cool. I told you it was much better to play with a board in the graveyard. This way you're closer to the dead, and they're more likely to interact with you," came the enthusiastic voice. "When did you die?" "It's saying 1948. That's super weird. That Phelan died in 1948. "Are you here with us?" came the voice again. This was Hamish's moment to strike while the iron was hot. He ran boldly towards the young teenagers, making a strange grunting sound, swinging his arms around violently. The teenagers screamed. They rose to their feet, hightailing it out of the cemetery, leaving behind the ouija board and crying out, "Bigfoot! Bigfoot!" Hamish grinned, feeling fully satisfied that those kids would not be coming back to the graveyard any time soon. He could hear them hurrying to their truck and skyrocketing out of the graveyard at breakneck speed. He remained in hiding when he saw 3 male figures all wearing hoodies strolling towards the graves, and one of them had a familiar canister of paint in his hands. It didn't take the youngsters long to find his mother's grave had been cleaned up. "Brand new canvas," he said happily. "Haven't these people learnt that every gravestone needs to be marked with my paint? And the devil's signature, of course." He could hear the youngsters laugh, as if they thought what they were doing was hilariously funny. Hamish wondered if these unruly teenagers' parents had any idea what their kids got up to behind their backs. "What shall I spray on it now?" says the young man. The teenagers thought of something rude to say. "How about it stinks in here?" Everyone began to laugh. "That's cool," came another voice. "I like that." "Can I have a turn, Ethan, with the canister? You're always hogging it to yourself," came one voice, sounding distinctly put out. Hamish manoeuvred himself behind the cherry blossom tree, close to his mother's grave. He gathered a heap of pebbles in his hands to throw at the youngsters. He had in mind that he would clandestinely appear from the tree once they looked up. He'd show just enough of himself to give them a very big scare. They would be in no doubt that they'd seen a Bigfoot, but he'd be very unfriendly towards them. To his amazement, someone else is showering the kids with pebbles and doing a much better job than he is, almost as if he's acquired a willing accomplice. The teenagers look startled.
"Bloody hell! Someone is throwing stones at us,"
says one of the boys, looking around the cemetery for any sign of movement. But Hamish remains stoically still, and in the dark, gloomy shadows the kids can see nothing beyond the gnarled silhouettes of the trees.
"Someone is watching us,"
says one of the boys.
"I've got the creeps. Someone is bloody watching us. I'm telling you, I can feel it. We need to get the hell out of here." "It's just some kid having a laugh at our expense,"
says one of the boys. He raises his voice.
"Stop it now, whoever you are. You'll be sorry. You hear me? You'll be sorry. If we catch you, I promise you, it's not just the tombstones that will be painted red. Just so you know, we know you're there. We're not intimidated. We're not scared of you. You hear me? We're not scared."
"I think we should get out of here," came the whining voice that clearly didn't feel quite as confident as his cocky friends.
Something doesn't feel quite right." "Oh, for goodness sake, Justin, are you going to continue being such a bloody baby? Maybe I should have left you home after all. Perhaps you should have stayed with Mummy and Daddy. When are you actually going to grow a pair?"
Hamish throws more pebbles at the teenagers and lets out a growl that impresses even him. Not bad for a beginner, he thinks.
"My God! Did you hear that?"
came the terrified voice.
"I told you something is here. Something's watching us. I'm getting out of here now."
Hamish leapfrogs from his hiding place, charging towards the unsuspecting teenagers. He can hear ponderous feet running beside him, emulating his shrieks and growls, as if this is one terribly exciting game. The teenagers look up at Hamish in horror, but Hamish soon realizes that they're not actually looking at him, but something that's standing right next to him. Their faces are charged with terror. They turn around and run through the graveyard at breakneck speed. He can hear their truck starting up and see a container of red spray paint rolling across the grass. Hamish chuckles loudly, only to hear his chuckle being emulated. He looks up towards his accomplice, who's helped him shower the unsuspecting teenagers with pebbles. The night is so tenebrous, it's difficult to make out the figure clearly, but a soft shower of moonlight highlights the ambiguous being most favourably, so there's no doubt what he's seeing. He realises in horror that the figure standing near him is a genuine Bigfoot. He almost feels as if the universe is having a laugh at his expense. He never entertained the notion that Bigfoot could actually be real. Hamish's eyes almost pop out of his head, like the buttons from a teddy bear. He doesn't know how to react to this strange creature that appears remarkably benevolent. He removes his Bigfoot head to breathe in the fresh air. He feels suffocated by the thing. The Bigfoot emulates him, trying to pull his own head off, but he can't, as the Bigfoot's head is tightly fitted onto his gargantuan shoulders that would make an NFL quarterback's shoulders look almost puny and pathetic. Hamish begins to chuckle, as this idiosyncratic creature has a great sense of humour, and everything he does is terribly funny. The Bigfoot extends his hands towards the Bigfoot head that he'd been wearing, so Hamish hands it over to him. He is an absolutely terrifying creature to look at, but Hamish is not afraid, as the creature's friendliness towards him is tangible, and his eyes are filled with warmth and intrigue. His energy is convivial. The Bigfoot studies the fake Bigfoot head, and is chatting away excitedly as he studies it. Hamish can tell the Bigfoot is a young male, even though he's enormously big, with a strapping body that could easily weigh 800 pounds. By all accounts, Hamish had thought his Bigfoot costume was an authentic-looking costume, But next to a genuine Bigfoot, it looks like a cheap reproduction. The Bigfoot is so human, towering at about 9 foot tall, with a human-looking face, high cheekbones, a flat nose, and deep-set dark eyes that twinkle with merriment. The creature continues to chatter, backwards and forwards in a strange language. And on occasion, Hamish can hear the words, "That was fun! That was fun!" All of a sudden, Hamish can hear a very distinctive whistle coming from the trees. The Bigfoot's expression drops. The creature appears visibly disappointed. "Impota, ahakobo, amasivanulo, banasina." "I have to go," he says, in Hamish's head. "Ipoti, hapa, it's my mum." He hands Hamish the head, but Hamish returns it to him. "Keep it," he says. The creature's face brightens, and then Hamish watches it as it glides away, glancing over its shoulders at him. Hamish smiles to himself. "I thought I looked like a Bigfoot in that costume. What was I smoking? I must be imagining things. I don't look at all like a Bigfoot." Hamish was soon to realise that one night scaring a few teenagers away from a graveyard in the middle of the night was not going to stop it being vandalised. Some might be scared off, but there would always be other people who would visit the graveyard and repeat the same abusive cycle. Hamish had no regrets. He had encountered a real Bigfoot, and that was an experience not to be sneezed at. 2 weeks later, Hamish was at home flicking through the local paper. He smiled as he read the headline, "Could Bigfoot be scaring off people at local cemetery?" A group of young girls claimed to have been chased by 2 angry creatures in the dead of night after visiting local cemetery. "I know exactly what we saw," said Angela Hilinski. "I'll never ever visit that cemetery again. There's something out there that wanted our blood. They chased us out of the cemetery. We managed to escape by a hair's breadth. Personally, I believe I'm lucky to be alive. Who knows what these monstrous beasts would be capable of? There were 2 of them, one very small, with a primate-looking face, and another one built like King Kong, with a human-looking face. I've never been so terrified in all my life, and I, for one, will be staying away from that cemetery, and would advise others to follow my lead. I personally believe the government knows about these things, and let me tell you, they're out for blood. They're highly dangerous." The group of young teenagers exclaimed that they had visited the graveyard out of curiosity, wondering if they might have a ghostly encounter or something of the kind. "I always knew going to a graveyard would be great fun, but I never knew I would have an encounter with 2 terrifying Bigfoots." When Angela Hilinski's friends were asked to comment about their experience, they were very evasive and said they hadn't seen anything that night, and that Angela Hilinski was off her head and making things up. "They won't tell you what we saw," Angela insisted. "They're scared no one will believe them, so they won't admit it. But I've never been afraid to come forward and to speak the truth." Mrs. Hilinski is insistent her daughter saw 2 Bigfoot. "My Angela would never make up a story like this just to get attention. She knows what she saw that night, and I believe her implicitly. I think everyone should know that there may be 2 dangerous Bigfoot loitering around that graveyard." You decide. Did Angela Hilinski rarely see 2 Bigfoot in that cemetery? Or are her friends right when they claim she was as drunk as a skunk and seeing things in her head that weren't actually there? You decide. Hamish grinned when he thought that he'd pulled off the act of his life. He thought about the nest in the church and the strange selection of stones, and now he knew with certainty that it was Bigfoot who had found refuge in that long-since abandoned church, and it heartened his heart to know that the church was being put to good use. Still, it wouldn't hurt to have a word with the town council about getting that graveyard cleaned up and the church restored, and Hamish knew he would stop at nothing to fight for that building. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.